All right, so our next panel is going to be on the social consequences of regional disparities. I'm Donna Fair here at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank in the Center for Indian Country Development, and we are going to start with Oren.
All right. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to be here, especially because I'm not actually an economist. I was excited when Morgan said he wasn't an economist, and then he had more regressions than anybody else. So I will have no regressions. There are some charts, none are pie charts, and so I hope that gets me at least honorary admission for the day. I'm closer to what I guess I would call a practitioner of a lot of the topics we've been discussing. I was Governor Romney's domestic policy director in 2012, and something that struck me during that experience was the incredible disconnect between the way economists and policymakers, left and right, were talking about the challenges in the country, and the way people in the country were talking about challenges in the country. And certainly I don't think we got it right. I don't think anybody got it right. But since then I've been working to try to understand what exactly we'd been getting wrong. And so that is the subject of a book I have coming out next month and what I want to talk about now. And basically centered on the question, what did the economists miss? And I'm at least going to pick a prominent economist, Adam Smith. So this is, I think, where a lot of what we talk about misses the mark and where we have to rethink how we do a lot of our conversations. And from The Wealth of Nations, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. The interest of producer be attended to only insofar as necessary for promoting that of consumer. The maxim is so perfectly self-evident that it would be absurd to attempt to prove it. As a rule of thumb, if you add that sentence to the end of your assertion, it may not be as ironclad as you think. Adam Smith was speaking about producers more in the context of the firm. But if we broaden the definition a little bit and think about the producer as the worker, we actually have two very interesting and divergent interests, the consumer and the worker. And of course, those aren't different people. Those are the same person, the consumer and the worker. But in speaking almost entirely in terms of consumer welfare, I think we miss what actually matters a lot more, which is people's welfare as workers. And I would argue there are sort of four dimensions on which people's welfare as workers is actually more relevant to our economic well-being, to our social well-being, and to our individual well-being. So first of all, from the perspective of individuals, we know fairly well from a lot of behavioral economics and psychological work that work, being engaged in productive activity, typically in the formal economy, is crucial to people's self-esteem and their mental health, especially for men. It's crucial to their life satisfaction and happiness. I don't actually put a lot of stock in a lot of happiness studies, except when they're longitudinal, when they look at the same person's happiness reporting over time. And what you find is that people's happiness returns to their prior level after almost any event: marriage, divorce, death of spouse, childbirth, injury, you name it. The one thing that they do not return to their prior level of happiness after is job loss. People never get used to unemployment. And finally, at the end of the day, work is crucial to economic opportunity. You can't get your second job until you have your first. You can't develop skills that are going to move you forward until you're actually doing something that uses skills in the first place, typically. And so if we're not attending to people's interests as workers, we're not actually attending to their own well-being. It's equally important to family, and this is something that we heard from both David and Nathan yesterday. We know that work, again, especially for men, is crucial to family formation. It's crucial to family stability once it exists. And then it's crucial for the outcomes of children. It's crucial for the outcomes of the children to have their own parents working. And it's crucial for the outcomes of children just to be in neighborhoods where people are working. It's crucial for community. We know that where people aren't working, we have higher levels of crime, higher levels of addiction, lower levels of social capital. And we have a phenomenon that I'm going to come back to in a little bit, which I will call exporting need, which is the idea that at the end of the day, local economies have to make something that the rest of the world wants if they are going to get things back from the rest of the world. And if they don't make anything the rest of the world wants, they have to rely on transfer payments. And then finally, I think at the macro level, work obviously is crucial to productivity and economic growth, and in particular, the kind of work matters. Okay, a services economy is good for a lot of things, but we know that there are some things about a more industrial activity that are crucial to getting growing productivity over time. And we also know that where we put in incentives for investment is going to guide what kinds of work we create in the economy over time. So how are we doing on work? This is some work from EIG that they've just put out that I think is very interesting. They divide all zip codes into 5 quintiles by how they're doing on an index of distress. So everything from home vacancy to poverty levels to education levels. And what they find is that over the period since the Great Recession, we've seen an incredible divergence in economic performance. So prosperous zones lost a lot of jobs, but actually recovered and have added a tremendous number of jobs. The bottom 2 quintiles haven't even recovered, and the bottom quintile doesn't look like it's ever going to. This bottom quintile is overwhelmingly rural, relatively speaking. The rural population is actually growing in distressed areas. So the number of people in distressed rural areas we have in this country is larger than it was 10 years ago. Rural zip codes are far more likely to be downwardly mobile. So rural zip codes are the only ones that in a significant group you see moving from the blue group to the red group over time. And to give you a sense of how distressed a distressed community is, in this red group, more than 40% of prime-age adults are not working. Now, the same trend shows up in things like business formation. So this is business formation by zip code. And what you find here, again, is that large counties, so dense counties, have seen virtually all of the business formation in our economy over the last decade. Large counties, about 60% of them, have more businesses than they did 10 years ago. Medium counties, only about 40% have more businesses than they did 10 years ago. Small counties, only about 20%. So that's the vast majority of overall counties, obviously not the vast majority of population, but for a very large share of our geography, we're actually seeing a pretty substantial decline in business activity. And I think this comes back to something that we actually started on yesterday with Esteban and the question that Neil asked him about how do we feel about one local coffee shop versus a Starbucks and a Pete's. And Esteban's answer fairly was almost entirely focused on consumer welfare. And it also hesitated a little bit because maybe consumer welfare isn't the entire story. And a few things happen when you don't have new local businesses forming in an area. One thing is you don't get some of the local job creation, but you also, maybe more importantly, don't get the kind of economic activity that is going to keep capital locally. So to the extent that one thing that firms do is actually generate profits, if those profits are generated to firms that are owned elsewhere, the profits leave the community. If they are generated to firms that are based locally, the profits stay within the community. And that turns out to make a pretty big difference for community well-being. Last thing I think is important to look at is not just total business formation, not just total jobs, but the kinds of jobs. And another thing you see, probably not surprisingly, is that the distressed areas are the ones that, relatively speaking, have much more emphasis on what we would call the industrial economy: production, transportation, mining, construction, and maintenance jobs. And David mentioned a little bit yesterday how there's something about those kinds of jobs that are actually really important, especially for less skilled workers, especially for men. When you actually go out across this whole range, it turns out that roughly half of all jobs in the economy that we would call good blue-collar jobs, so pay more than $15 an hour, are in those occupations. And so those are disproportionately in rural areas. Those are disproportionately what we see in the distressed areas. And frankly, those are disproportionately the kinds of jobs that we see going away. So the question was the social consequences. I think this is a helpful map to look at in thinking about the social consequences of the divergence that we're seeing. Now, I think Donald Trump's election is wildly overdetermined. We can all pick what we care about most and say that that's why Donald Trump won. The reality is that he won because of a very small shift in a few states. But I think it's actually useful to step back and ask, how far would Donald Trump have been from winning 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago? I think the best way to understand what happened is that we had a worsening situation over time in large swaths of the country. And 2016 happens to be the moment it sort of broke through. It could have happened sooner, it could have happened later, but it was something that we were headed for. And then I think it's important to read what Hillary Clinton said about it afterwards. I won the places that represent 2/3 of America's gross domestic product. So I won the places that are optimistic, diverse, dynamic, moving forward. That is true as a factual statement. It's a bizarre, bizarre political statement for anyone anywhere on the spectrum, but especially for someone left of center. The idea that, well, I was the candidate of the people who are doing well and don't need help is crazy. And yet it's actually something you will see argued and pointed out as a somehow relevant and Clinton supporting data point in a variety of contexts. And so this kind of divergence in, where is the GDP and what sort of implications does that have for how well people are doing in various areas and how they're feeling politically ends up having a consequence for everybody, whether you are in one of the areas or the other. Now, I think in the wake of 2016 in particular, the most common political framing that we've heard, and what I want to focus on, encourage everyone to not think in terms of, is what's called the open versus closed framework. So this was how David Brooks described it. The coming political movements will be identified as open and closed. Open is those who believe in open trade, open immigration, active foreign policy, racial integration. Closed is, of course, the opposite. And what we need is support free trade, support immigration, and then flood the zone for those who are challenged. This is Fareed Zakaria with virtually the same argument, not between left and right, but between open and closed, favor free trade and immigration, and technology dynamism, or are concerned by it. And his solution, likewise, is open and armed. So we're going to be open, and we're going to have a bristling armory of tools and training with more ambitious government programs for anyone who's struggling. There's also a social component to it. The Economist also loves the open and closed framing and isn't sure what, but would like to devise policies that spread the benefits of globalization. But they were also happy to endorse this framing, which is that the closed people, or the drawbridge up team, is those who feel encroached upon by criminals, gypsies, spongers, asylum seekers, and Brussels bureaucrats who think the bad things will go away if we lock the doors. And the open folks are the people who think there's a big, beautiful world out there full of good people if only we could open our arms and embrace each other. I understand why people in the open camp like to describe our conflict in these terms. I think it very badly misunderstands the nature of the conflict we have, and I think it is sending us in the direction of frankly, more and less constructive populism if we try to cling to it. The problem with this view is that it stipulates that the sort of globalization, continued advancing of the economic trends we've been on are the non-negotiable starting point. And then we're going to have to find something for everybody else. And typically what we have to find for everybody else is some combination of they should move, we're going to train them to succeed in the new economy, or we're going to give them transfer payments. We have an overwhelming amount of evidence that these are not good solutions. And so I want to take a quick look at why. One is the idea that people will move. So I think it's important to understand that geographic mobility has never been the norm in this country. We have an idea in our head of the Western frontier, of somehow just people moving to wherever the opportunity is, and certainly some people do, and certainly we want people to have that opportunity. But virtually every state in this country has seen its population grow every decade for the last 100 years. Okay, that gives you 500 data points. In only 33 of those data points is there a decline, and the state with the greatest such decline is actually Washington, D.C. So the idea that just people move out of places, it's not true. Iowa, through farm mechanization, essentially never saw its population decline. Maine, if you want to think of a very different type of deindustrialization, never saw its population decline. Oklahoma, the quintessential Dust Bowl, saw a very small decline in the 1930s of about 2.5% of population. That's what counts in our consciousness as massive migration. And in fact, if you take a look, there's a very good NBR paper I recommend. They took a look at the Dust Bowl migration. First of all, they found farmers were the least likely to leave. And in fact, out-migration rates didn't even change. The only reason you see that dip in Oklahoma is because people stopped moving in, which is certainly a rational response to what was going on in Oklahoma in the Great Depression, but it doesn't suggest that picking up and moving is actually what people have ever done. It's not something they are likely to do because it's not how people organize their lives. The median distance that an American adult lives from their mother is 18 miles. Most Americans live less than 18 miles from their mother. 80% live within a 2-hour drive. 37% of Americans have never lived outside their hometown. And it's important to recognize and keep in mind as we think about that also the educational and income-related dispersion here. Okay? Those without college degrees, those who actually would think maybe have the least opportunity, maybe are most in need of moving, are least likely to move. They're much more likely to stay close to home. They're much more likely to remain in their hometowns. And it's interesting that we've watched as a lot of these geographic areas have struggled and we've seen a decline in geographic mobility. I think the response of a lot of economists has been to throw up their hands and say, this is bizarre, why isn't everybody moving? One potential answer is because there is a decline in their areas. Okay? The way that mobility happens typically is not people leaving depressed areas where everybody is struggling. You actually, it turns out, tend to need a very strong social and economic base to make the choice to move or to have the move be successful. And so it's not that we have struggling areas because we have no geographic mobility. It's actually more likely that we have so little geographic mobility because we've created so many struggling areas. Second point, not everyone can become a knowledge worker. I thought the point about how the skills map makes truckers and programmers not a good map is an interesting, and I like the quantitative way of looking at it. I think there's a slightly broader and more intuitive point that truckers and programmers are not the same people. That the American population that we have has an enormous dispersion of basic endowments, both at birth and very early in life, and that those produce outcomes that we've frankly shown very little ability of being able to change. I think we should keep trying. I think it's an important area of policy, but we need to be honest that we don't know how to do it. And that at this point, if you think about how our pipeline that we have tried to design, college through 4-year degree, is working, it's actually failing miserably for most people. Okay? If you start with a cohort of 100 ninth graders, still about 18 will fail to graduate from high school on time. Of the remainder, 25 aren't even going to enroll in college after high school. Of the remainder, about half are going to enroll in college and not complete, even within 150 to 200% of the expected time. And of the roughly quarter who even complete a degree, close to half of those aren't even going to end up in a job that requires a college degree in the first place. So that high school to college to career pipeline is working for maybe a little less than 20 out of 100. Call it the fortunate fifth. And what we do for the other 4/5 is to sort of shrug and say sorry about that. And we actually allocate virtually all of our resources to people who continue on this track. So we spend about $150 billion a year subsidizing and directly funding higher education. Federal funding last year for vocational education was $1 billion, and it's actually been declining for 30 years. Should we have any confidence we can get better at this? Well, here's what we've done in terms of spending per pupil, K through 12, over the last 40 years. We doubled it. Here's our progress on test scores over that period. SATs is a little unfair because more people take it, but the other two are fairly comparable samples. And here's our graduation rate. And it's true that more people are enrolling in college, but here's how we're doing on bachelor's degrees over 40 years. From people born in 1950, so who were entering college around 1970, through people born in 1990 who were entering college around 2010. You'll see there's virtually no difference, and in fact, we are doing worse now than we were a generation ago. So none of this is to say we shouldn't do education reform. It is to say that skills and get people to graduate from college and train them for the jobs our economy has is not a credible solution to their problems. Last point, this is my favorite chart. This is dependence on government programs in 1979 from the New York Times. So the percent of personal income by county that came from federal transfers. And this is what it looked like in 2014. Now, one thing to notice is that not everything gets darker. If you actually pick a city to focus on briefly, they're actually doing okay. Virtually the entire darkening is in all of the rural areas of the country, and it's not just the Rust Belt or Appalachia or some stereotypical area. It's literally just about the entire country outside of the cities. And then the other question to ask is if we should be upset about this or we should celebrate it. And this is where I want to come back to the consumer versus producer point where I started. Our framework of economic policy in this country is what I call economic piety, which is that there's an economic pie and we should grow it. And hopefully when we grow the economic pie, everyone gets more. And if we don't, we can redistribute from those who did get more to those who don't have as much. According to the tenets of economic piety, this is something we should celebrate. We grew the economy a lot. Look how effectively we were redistributing money to the places that are struggling. And so this is the American success story of our economic policy for the past 40 years. If consumer welfare is your measure, that I believe is how you would read this chart. And I don't think any of us actually would believe this chart because I don't think at the end of the day we actually think that's how we should be evaluating people's lives or our economic policy. I think how we should actually be interpreting this is to say, wow, we have essentially crushed the ability of a large share of the country to achieve self-sufficiency as individuals, but especially as communities. You know, if you travel in a lot of these areas, one thing you'll notice is that almost every town has a sparkling occupational therapy office. That occupational therapy office is now the exporter for the town. It exports its ability to care for the people in the town on disability to the country in return for very large cash payments. And that's where the actual hard currency comes into the community that allows them to then buy everything they might want from the rest of the country. And that's not a sustainable model. I think when you look at this, what you have to say is the way that we should be measuring people's well-being is not in terms of their income per se, and especially not in terms of their income after transfer payments. We should be asking about what do we actually know about what drives welfare in both the short term and the long run. So for instance, could we have a metric like, I can work a job that supports my family? Should we maybe have a metric like, my kids can visit their grandparents every week? Because I don't know how much that's worth, but I know that those kinds of things, relative to someone's overall well-being, are an enormous share of the total. If I was going to do a pie chart, that's the one I would show as a hypothetical, how much of someone's well-being is actually their market income and consumption, what I would call, I have an iPhone, and how much of it is, I live in a community where I have other people who I know and trust and can engage activities where I find fulfillment, I feel self-sufficient and have work that is meaningful and contributes, and I'm engaged with my family, my own family and my extended family. And I believe typically we call those things in the economic literature amenities. But if those things are, say, 70 to 80% of what's dictating people's well-being in the short run, and is then dictating the opportunity that their kids have, then any model that's not actually built on that is completely missing the picture of what we're doing. I want to talk briefly about whether an alternative is actually viable, because one claim that will be made is that this is just a function of technology. It's sort of exogenous forces, and I'm sitting here blaming economists for bad policy, and that's not fair. It's actually a function of progress. I don't think that's true, and I want to first make the point by comparing trade to automation. From a consumer welfare perspective, trade and automation are equivalent. And in fact, you'll read in the economic literature direct comparisons that you can even think of these things as comparable mechanisms. From a worker's perspective, they are radically different. So when a factory closes because we're going to make the thing in China instead, the jobs are just gone. There's no new economic activity, it's just gone. When automation occurs, the jobs slowly shift. Okay? Factories don't automate 100% overnight. They don't even automate a single part overnight. If you think about what wildly effective productivity growth, let's say you get 5% productivity growth, which would be extraordinary, that means you're talking about 15 years to double the productivity of your plant, at which point you would still have half the workers in it. Trade is unconstrained. There's no limit, really, to how quickly you can move all your jobs somewhere else. There's a very serious limit to how quickly you can automate your factory, and it is constrained by the workers you actually have living in the community where the factory is. Now, employers call this the skills gap and complain about it. I call it a really good reason to make sure that you're building processes that your workers can actually execute. And so you might have the workers who are actually there working with the technology. You also might have new people coming to the community, new high-skilled, high-income people. And if what you end up having happen is new high-skilled people, then instead of just no jobs, you actually get new, better jobs. You might have to move some people who were less skilled workers in the factory to less skilled workers in the local services economy, but that's a viable move if new high-skilled people are coming in to work in the factory. It is not a viable move if you just close the factory. Not everyone can serve coffee to each other. And finally, there's a very real social and cultural implication to saying that you're going to be a place that doesn't make anything anymore. And it's certainly harder to quantify, but the difference between a community that still makes something and sends it to the rest of the world in return for the things the world sends to it is a very different community from one that is simply relying on transfer payments. Now, the data also happens to support that automation isn't the problem. And this will look similar to a chart David showed yesterday, but I want to put another lens on it, which is to look at real manufacturing value add. Okay, real manufacturing value add rose at a pretty steady trend for most of the century. And then after 2000, it pretty much stopped rising. This is what employment looks like in the manufacturing industry. I'm just starting 1980 here. David showed you that it was steady to maybe a little bit down before then. Actually, we've lost about a third of the manufacturing jobs. If value added had continued growing at the pre-2000 pace, we would actually have more manufacturing jobs today than we had in 2000. So put it another way, productivity growth is responsible for 0% of the manufacturing job loss, at least relative to prior trends. And our failure to continue actually growing our industrial economy and make stuff is responsible for all of it. So implications for public policy. I want to highlight three. How do things change if you actually think from a worker welfare perspective instead of a consumer welfare perspective? One is that balance matters. Trade deficits actually do matter. The idea that if other countries send us stuff and we can send them treasury bonds instead of sending them stuff, that is great from a consumer welfare perspective. It's disastrous from a worker welfare perspective. The idea that we can just bring in a lot of immigrants because that's more workers and costs will go down and things will be cheaper is great from a consumer welfare perspective. It is not necessarily great if you're concerned about the balance of supply and demand for various types of skills in the labor market. If all you care is the maximum total GDP, then trying to just push as many people through to the 4-year BA and letting everyone else fall by the wayside might be a great plan. If you actually care about what % of your workforce or what % of your population can work a job that supports a family, at least investing as much effort on a non-college track as you do on the college track would have to be a place that you start. Second is that speed matters. And this is something that you hear about a lot at economics conferences like this, the phrase "in the long run." And in theory, we don't worry about disruptions because in the long run, everything will be fine. And what we know in practice is that that is simply not true. In the long run, you can actually land yourself at an equilibrium that is disastrous. We have certainly inner city areas in our economies that have been really economically depressed for generations now. There's no evidence that in the long run that recovers. And what we see increasingly is that we have now created comparable economic situations in suburban and especially more rural areas. And again, there's no evidence that if you erode enough of the social endowments in those areas, that they will ever be able to return to the kind of equilibrium you want. And then the last point, and this is a little bit more of a political one, is that sequencing matters. The current approach and attitude that I would say is widely endorsed, especially by more educated Americans, is that obviously we need to keep the good thing going for the economy that we are happy with. And we're going to have to figure out something for everyone else. And maybe we don't know what it is, but we'll work on it. That's not a politically viable approach. I would say it's not an especially moral approach, but it is definitely not a politically viable approach. And we need to flip that around and think about it the other way. That if we want support for an economy that is advancing technologically, that is open, which frankly most Americans would like, if they could also have healthy communities, if we really value all of those things, it's incumbent on us to start by figuring out how we are going to bring those regions back and build an economy that is actually inclusive for them. David said at one point, well, reshoring a bunch of automated manufacturing would be great for us. It would be disastrous for the rest of the world. I don't think that's true, because the alternative isn't us just going along in the rest of the world getting to do the manufacturing. The alternative is the political trajectory our country is on right now that will continue to get worse. I think we actually need to focus on making sure that we have a sustainable, including industrial economy here as a prerequisite to actually being able to engage very constructively in the rest of the world. That's what I wanted to say about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oren. So Yannis from Tufts.
So these are advances, and this is, okay. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a fascinating conference. Let me move quickly to the subtitle. I'm going to be working with two examples. I'm hoping to demonstrate through these two examples that social interactions do matter. In my examples, both of my examples are going to be international. So, moving quickly, essentially two different demonstrations here. So the first part of the talk goes back to a paper that Esteban and Kurt Schwindheiny and Harry Overman and I published only 10 years ago. And the point of the paper, the point that I'm emphasizing much more now, is that social interactions are ubiquitous and central to the urban economy. That was also in the old paper. But I go back to the same experiment, the same econometric experiment with more data and richer data. The second part of the talk is about corruption and rent-seeking in economic growth, and this one is jointly with Kostas Zariadis. The first part is jointly with Emmanuel Tranos, who is actually a geographer in the University of Birmingham. The paper with Kostas Zariadis emphasizes how social interactions are critical in linking rent-seeking behavior and corruption. Rather linking norms with rent-seeking behavior and corruption. And we look at the evolution of corruption and rent-seeking via a model of economic growth in the presence of social interactions. And we actually use two, not just one, sense of social interactions. So there are social interactions from the norms as well as individual social effects, and of course I'm going to talk about this in more detail. And we use the model to structure empirical investigations. And so, as I said before, both of these examples are international. Okay, the first part of the talk, the impact of information and communication technology on urban decentralization. This is a rather simple formula. It looks complicated, but quite simple. And it comes from Esteban and Mark's paper from 2007, adapted in our Gang of Four paper. The idea is that every city and every industry is affected by a TFP shock. And this TFP shock is translated via social effects, and by that I mean this part of the formula here. And so H is human capital, N is employment. If these exponents are zero, then there's just a IID shock. However, this is not exactly what we think is happening, so we're trying to test it. And so going from an assumption, IID shocks in this component of TFP to the variance of the log of the city size distribution. And this is a formula adapted from Wright and Rossi-Hansberg, or rather Rossi-Hansberg and Wright, I'm sorry. And the key thing here is that if adoption at the country level of information and communication technology goes through these two exponents here, so if ICT adoption weakens these exponents, it weakens the social effects that translate the shocks to TFP in every city. And of course, if these coefficients go down, this variance also goes down. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we do this again, just as we did in this 10-year-old paper. And the idea is that, so ICT adoption generates smaller dispersion, which means greater urban decentralization. So what we do in the old paper, in the new paper, is we take classic regression along the lines of the assumption that the distribution is described by a Pareto distribution. So we're regressing the log rank against the log size. This coefficient, the Pareto exponent, is a very good measure of the dispersion of city sizes because of this stark characteristic heterogeneity of city sizes. And then the next part is we take this estimate and we regress it against a number of variables, including in particular ICT adoption variables. So the ICT adoption is measured at the country level by means of landlines, telephone landlines per capita, mobile subscriptions per capita, internet subscriptions per capita. Now, in addition to this, in some sense, narrow measure of dispersion, we actually test robustness just as we did before by means of the Gini coefficient, the Hirschman-Heftel index, and the coefficient of variation. So let me move on. First, some facts. We didn't have mobile subscriptions in the 10-year-old paper, but we do now. And our internet data was not as rich as it is now. So we see here that internet and mobile are very highly correlated, but fixed lines and mobile telephony are virtually zero correlated. And I asked my undergraduate students, has any of you ever owned a landline subscription? To them, it's something that grandparents maybe had, but not they don't have. Okay, so all right. Now, what are these variables here? These variables worked before quite well. They bring in the size of the country and then the variation in log GDP over time, and some key sort of urban-inspired variables like trade openness, share non-agricultural in GDP, share of government expenditure, and the size of the country, the number of cities, and so forth. Okay, now, of course, we have to be careful about this because urban structure, the size distribution, and the adoption of ICT are jointly determined. And we do this actually as we did before. We use as instruments public telephone monopoly and time since its deregulation, and private telecom monopoly and time since its deregulation. Now, interestingly, it worked before, it works again because the same basic industry is producing. I mean, there are different firms, perhaps, but it's the same basic industry. Okay, let me just say that this is a mapping of all the empirical results, but I'd rather go to the tables, and then I can come back and okay. Okay, all right. Is it possible to enlarge this, like by means of control? Yeah, thank you very much. That's enough, actually. Thank you very much. All right, great. Okay, all right, so the action is on this coefficient here. And this is the second stage regressions when we regress the Pareto exponent against a whole bunch of covariants, including in particular the the number of landlines. And we see there is a negative effect, quite significant. These are various regressions, but I'm going to stick to this last column, 8. And the same story, by means of a simpler table, is there when we look at internet regressions. And not exactly the same, but nonetheless, column 8, which is the hard reaction, looks very similar. And then finally, mobile telephony, which is a new variable. We didn't have data on that back then. And again, it works very similarly. Okay, so again, this effect. All right, now testing robustness is looking at the same story, except that we measure dispersion by means of the Gini coefficient, the Hirschman-Heffernan index, and the coefficient of variation for all these 3 variables, and things work very similarly. Let me add, by the way, that this data is for many developed countries, actually exclusively developed countries, and it's quite interesting that it works. I've played around with a broader data set, but things are not clear, so I'm not prepared to talk about it now. So now I'm going to move to the second part of my talk, which is the work in progress with Kostas Zariadis. Now we need to enlarge it again, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you very much, great, okay. All right, so the story here is how do we bring the impact of conventional but non-economic factors on growth? Things like culture, politics, history, and institutions. And this work has gone basically towards developing a theory of corruption, rent-seeking, given history, culture, and institutions, and they operate critically via social interactions. At the second stage of this work, we try to explain the institutions, and finally, we have some tentative empirics. Quite a few empirics, actually, but I'm going to just describe them rather than go through them. So, all right, now basically the model is standard. It's an international model, but we focus on one country, though it's easy to see what's going on internationally. OLG model, 2 overlapping generations, only the young work. There are 2 types of people. Producers, type 1, are more productive. They may be producers or enforcers, and they may be corrupt. And type 2 are producers or rent seekers. Okay, now I talked about, inadvertently, a slide was left out. Let me define what I mean by corruption and rent seeking. I acknowledge that they're very closely related. So in the popular meanings, bribery, embezzlement, nepotism, extortion, racketeering, illegal licensing, tax evasion, and information misreporting. But in the 4 more formal scientific synonyms, rent-seeking, predation, appropriation, extraction, involuntary distribution, property crime, and official corruption. I think official corruption is arguably one of the most unambiguously defined of these concepts. And let me say right at the outset, we have not been able to find data on rent-seeking at the level of the country. There's a lot of data on institutions. I'm going to be specific on that. There's a lot of data on corruption, but no data on rent-seeking as such. And let me also mention the obvious, which is every model is a toy model. So this is a toy model of corruption and rent-seeking. But the key ingredient here is this component here, which is going to bring social interactions as a cross effect, as I'm going to describe in a second. So this reflects a non-conformism by the all who disagree with the agent of the other type. And there is an individual social effect, which I'm going to describe in just 1 second. Okay, now, notation. X is the share of corrupt enforcers. They're all type 1 types. Rho is the share of type 2 rent seekers. And to ground the story, we use as norms the lagged values of these two variables. There is a culture parameter, and I think it's best described from this description by Greif. Cultural beliefs are the ideas and thoughts common to several people that govern interaction between these people and among them, which capture people's expectations with respect to actions that are at stake, blah, blah, blah. Now, there are various measures of this culture parameter, but we found most useful, although we played with other ones, we found most useful this measure by Hofstadter, which is sigma equals 0, individualism, and sigma equals 1, collectivism. Now, social interactions, as I said, link to antisocial behavior, and this works sort of like punitive redistribution in some sense. And finally, the concept being introduced is of institutions. I think it's best described by North. The humanly devised constraints that structure human interactions, rules, laws, constitutions, and their enforcement. Okay, if there is no corruptible people, no externalities, no social interactions, this is a standard toy model I teach in my growth class for the world economy with free movement of capital. The picture is standard, and sorry. Okay, so without corruption and rent seeking, capital labor ratios are equalized across the world economy, and GDP per capita differences disappear at time 0, disappear at once. Now, how about describing the agents when they are corruptible and there is rent seeking and corruption? Okay, now, producers. Producers of type 1, the more productive people, they produce with a standard called Douglas technology, and there is an income tax. But there are rent seekers out there who are after them, and they match with producers using a DMP-style matching model. Z is the ratio of rent seekers to victims. There's a probability that they are going to be looted, and so the expected income for the producers is expected after looting, as it were, and this is after tax. And this is the social effect. So if this is very high, if rent seeking in the previous period is very high, this is low. Now, producers of type 2 who are honest have an identical income except for this coefficient gamma, which is gamma is less than 1 to define that type 2 people are less productive, other things be equal, than type 1 people. And the social norm here is the lagged the instance of rent seeking. Okay, now type 2 people, that's where the rent seekers come in. And type 2 people, if they produce, I already mentioned that, but if they're rent seekers, then it's a more complicated outcome because you see we want to have the fact that there are enforcers, cops, who are running after them, trying to prevent them from looting. And so this factor comes in, and so producer income, probability the rent seeker meets the producer, the rent seeker evades enforcers, and then these are the two social effects. This is actually the individual social effect work here to reduce the dimensionality of the problem, or otherwise we would have another random variable running around and it would be much more complicated. Now, enforcers. If the enforcers are honest, they may too be looted. You know, cops are susceptible to rent seeking as well. The norm is different in this case, but that's a minor thing as we'll see later on. Now, how about corrupt enforcers, cops? Well, they may be caught with probability pi, in which case they forfeit wages, but they consume the looted income from rent seeking. I mean, this is really simplifying assumption. Think of it, you know, champagne opened, then the bubbles vanish, it's useless. So maybe I should find a better example for this. But in any case, so there are two components to the income of the rogue enforcers, the corrupt enforcers. This is what they formally get, plus the loot after after they capture rent seekers. Notice that it's the anti-social income that is subject to the individual social effect. And so this we have in order to have a richer story. Okay, basically because of this individual social effect, the epsilon, we have a very simple story that leads us to a dynamic model. And let me just, I'd like to describe the empirical results. So let me just say that out of this basic description comes, you know, right away that honest behavior is more likely if social norms are good, low values of corruption and rent seeking. Honest behavior is more likely if institutions are strong. High value of theta. Theta stands for the intensity of enforcement. And the role of culture, the sensitivity to anti-social behavior, the sigma, is unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, ambiguous. Okay, now there's a dynamic model, as I said. After various variations, they work very nicely. We want to know what happens in the long run, or we want to know what happens on the transition to the long run. So I'm going to skip this stuff by making a number of observations. In fact, I would even skip this, but show you the picture. Here we have, in the horizontal axis, is the previous period incidence of rent seeking. In the vertical axis is the current one. And so, even though this is simple, coming out of a rather complicated model, it still allows us quite a few predictions. So, the first prediction I'd like to talk about is the fact that GDP may be decreasing as enforcement theta increases for small values of theta. Sometimes, and even serious people have argued that corruption lubricates the wheels of trade. Well, not ultimately in this story, fortunately. Okay, so that's because in the model, as you increase enforcement, you shift a lot of labor there, and as a result, GDP suffers, but not ultimately. Okay, so that's the picture I just mentioned, but the prediction is very interesting regarding corruption, rent seeking. The higher quality the institutions, theta, the lower rent seeking, the lower the corruption, and GDP, it may go down, it doesn't have to go down all the time, and ultimately it goes up. Better institutions, higher GDP. Okay, now, summary of the predictions. And rent seeking and corruption under the simplifying assumption that the norms in the public sector are the same as the norms in the private sector. So both X and rent seeking, rather corruption and rent seeking, go down as institutional quality improves. As human capital improves, gamma is the productivity of type 2 people. These two variables are increasing functions of their own respective norms, the lagged values, and depending upon the sensitivity to the incidence of corruption and seeking, this culture variable, the prediction depends upon the intensity of this effect. Ultimately, at the steady state, corruption and rent seeking are decreasing functions of institutional quality and independent of norms. GDP per capita is decreasing function of contemporaneous corruption, rent-seeking, and of past rent-seeking and corruption. And even though, as I said, these results are derived under this assumption, if we don't make this assumption, we just have more complicated dynamics. So, that's not so serious. Now, here are institutions that we work with. Okay, so this is this Hofstadter index, collectivism, more collective society, lower GDP per capita. These are average for the entire sample. Okay, so average quality of law and order, average speediness of the judicial process, effectiveness of crime control, independence of prosecution, and this is the corruption index from Transparency International. Okay, so this is the context for the entire sample. And let me talk about results that we have obtained. There are quite a few, so I'm only summarizing them here. But they're largely in line with the predictions of the model. So this is a basic regression that we run with different types of specifications. Random effects, fixed effects. Generally, random effects work better than fixed effects. The problem with fixed effects would have been preferable, but we will need to have a time-varying measure of culture. And I will say one more thing about that in a second. So large corruption has a negative effect. Large individual institutions have a positive effect. The entire vector of institutions have generally positive effect. Lagged human capital, very strong positive effect, and the index that we use to proxy for culture has a strong negative effect. Collectivism, greater collectivism means lower GDP. Now, as I mentioned, we would like to have time-varying measures of culture, and there are a couple out there, but they actually have been disappointing so far. Maybe we ought to do something smarter. Okay, so let's then move on. So here is looking at corruption and how corruption is affected by lagged corruption, lagged institutions, culture, human capital, depending upon the specification. The lagged corruption has a very strong effect on current corruption. And of course, the institutions have a positive effect. But this specification is useful because it allows to see the extent that institutions may affect the possible multiplicity of equilibria in corruption. So using these regressions, one can plot this, and a little bit of statistical work, rather computational work, can reveal that there could be a low level of corruption, a high level of corruption, and in between unstable equilibrium. But the most interesting aspect of this specification is that stronger institutions mean that we're more likely to have a unique, not three different steady states. Okay, now finally looking at institutions, although I didn't talk about how in the model we try and endogenize institutions. We're doing that, but I haven't done it yet. I haven't presented it here, and I'm not going to present it. But by the way of anecdote, I've given this part of the talk under the title "Getting to be Denmark." Obviously stolen from Fukuyama, but the key thing is that it's hard to be Denmark. And so here are some results. large corruption has a strong negative effect on current institutions. Large GDP has a strong positive effect on current institutions. Collectivism has a strong negative effect on current institutions. And human capital passingly has in some regressions a negative effect. Nonetheless, there are some exceptions, and so effective crime control, this variable here, or vigorous enforcement, or prosecution of official abuse, this variable, it works well for that. One final set of results is that we look at the entire vector of institutions that we have available. Of course, this limits the times that we have within which we can have data on all these institutions. But nonetheless, the same idea works again, that the effects of large corruption is typically negative. Again, since I have 14 seconds left, let me just say again, getting to beat Denmark is not exactly easy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Abby from the University of Notre Dame.
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame.
I have to do that more often than you might think. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to actually change gears on us just a little bit. I'm actually talking about a policy proposal that I put out earlier this year. I put this out through the Hamilton Project. If you're not familiar with that, they solicit policy proposals from social science researchers, predominantly economists, but not exclusively. So the idea is to have an evidence base solidly from research that then can tell us a bit more about what policy should be doing. So if you are not an economist, this might be your half hour in which we get to say a little bit about how we might take all of the really great research that we've seen so far that tells us so very much about what is going on. And in this case, I'm going to take some of that. You'll see that some of what I build on as an evidence base actually comes from folks in this room. We're going to take that, build on it, and turn it into a suggestion about ways, in this case, to increase geographic mobility at college entrance and exit. And when Oren and I were talking at the beginning, we actually have some overlap here, and I think this will in some ways respond to some of his concerns on both in a specific way about the market for college graduates, but also maybe even more broadly about whether it's even possible for economists to craft useful and well-informed policy. So we'll see what he thinks at the end. So let me tell you a bit first about why the market for college students, and I'm going to say students because, as you saw, I'm going to be talking about those who are coming to attend college and those who are also leaving at the end of that, which may be completion and may not actually be completion. Why the market for college students is itself related to regional disparities. So actually, as Oren pointed out, moving is not perhaps as common in the United States as we like to think it is. I think often when I talk about the migration statistics and the long-run trends in migration that I've worked on documenting, people are often surprised both that things are not as mobile as they might have thought and that they're declining over time. The same is true when we think about moving to college. So I think certainly in the media and in our minds, and probably for most of us in this room, moving over a distance to go to college was a feature of our college experience. But for most students in the United States, and I'm going to show you numbers on this, they attend college close to their home. And that's also been true for a very long time. So that's one fact. A second fact is that, as we've talked about quite a bit, geographic mobility is declining in the United States. And because new labor market entrants, and in particular new labor market entrants from college, are a very mobile segment of the population, these declines have actually, because they are broad-based, had a larger absolute impact in terms of declining mobility in percentage point terms for this group. So we've seen broad declines for everyone. I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is focused on either labor market entrants or college graduates in particular, but because those groups are high mobility groups, the declines have been very large in absolute terms for them. So if we take these 2 points and put them together, this is going to imply that the skill level in a local market is related to local college availability. And as we've talked in some of the papers that preceded this, there are all kinds of other factors that might reinforce this and in fact drive bigger divergence over time. Things like innovation clusters and agglomeration economies, those can certainly magnify this. But these two facts alone would really already generate some place level disparities in the level of skill in the population. So let me tell you a bit more about the evidence base that then precedes the proposal that I'm going to make for ways we might address the concerns that come out of this. So the first is that, like I mentioned, local college is tremendously important for determining college attainment. So we've actually known this as economists for quite a long time. So we have, in our research, often used proximity to college as a way to identify or get useful variation in how likely people are to go to college. We've taken advantage of that and used it fruitfully to find out more about the benefits that college brings to people who attain it. More recently, Patrick Lapid's work, and he's currently at the CFPB, studies UC system expansions. So we have not had too many opportunities in recent history to look at this, but the UC system added several four-year college campuses over the late 90s to mid-2000s. He finds very stark evidence that primarily these openings influence students who were in close geographic proximity to those colleges already. It did not enhance overall college going by people elsewhere in the state, but for students who were nearby those new campuses that opened, college attainment increased markedly. So we have really good evidence that if you have a college nearby, you are much more likely to attend. I can actually show you as well what this looks like for the population of students more generally. So this is for students attending a four-year public college. It doesn't actually look that different, except magnitudes change if we select on either a broader college perspective or a smaller. What you see really at the end, in the most recent year of data that we have available, is that almost 70% of four-year public college students are attending within a 2-hour drive of their home. And over half are attending in under an hour's radius drive from their home, in under 50-mile radius. So most college students, when I say most, this is what I mean, are attending college close to their home. And this feeds into the fact that what we know is that if you live near a college, you're more likely to attend. So this is somewhat regionally disparate by urban and rural status, but perhaps not as disparate as one might think. So rural areas have less access to a local college, but not uniformly so. And I'm also going to show you a bit about county characteristics across counties that do and don't have local college access. I'm also, at this point, here's my map, but I'm going to plead for better data on college access. So these data are, I think, greatly to a first approximation correct. These are also the best data that we have. They have a limitation in that the Department of Education doesn't require states to separately report their branch campuses by county. So there are some counties that are underreported as having college access here, but our best guess is that that's not tremendously significant. What you see here is a map of colleges that have a 2- or a 4-year institution within their boundaries and colleges that have no such access. So that's how I'm defining college access in this analysis. About 60% of counties have no local college access. They do tend to be kind of sparsely populated, so that really ends up being about 14% of the potential college-going population. So great geographic disparity in access, somewhat rurally concentrated, but not necessarily impacting an enormous fraction of the population, but one, again, as Oren pointed out, that I think we should have serious concerns about in the policy setting. So just to tell you a bit more about these counties, I already illustrated to you or mentioned that they tend to be more rural, but not exclusively so. So you might be surprised to know that colleges with, or counties with local college access, about a quarter of them are rural. With no local college access, about half. So that's definitely different. But when we look at other characteristics like the poverty rate, the share of the families in those counties who are middle class, median household income, share minority, the counties themselves actually don't look that different. So there's a bit of a rural-urban gradient, perhaps not as big as we would expect, but other characteristics look similar. So what this tells us is that geographic proximity to college is something that affects a really broad spectrum of types of counties, even if it tends to not be a giant portion of the population. Okay. So what I've already painted for you is a picture of how at college going, the time you might enter, your proximity to a physical college is going to be an important determinant of whether or not you get to go. I'm now going to talk a bit about the evidence base for what's happening on the other side of college. What do we know about what's happening when people are leaving? I will make a plug that I think this is an understudied area, this transition from the college enrollment experience into the labor market, but there's quite a bit that we do know from previous research. So as I already mentioned, migration is declining over time. That's been well documented, and I'll just show you my personal graph of that here. What you see in the top lines are those younger populations, so those right around the college leaving time, and you see that the decline for them in percentage point terms has been largest. So that's what I was referring to before. On the other hand, we do have declines in migration that have been happening throughout the population, so this isn't explained entirely by college graduates by any means, but for them the declines have meant a really large change. What we have not talked much about in this conference is the fact that job change is also declining. So going along with migration as a large change of labor market and a large transition, I and some other co-authors and others working in this literature have documented that changes across employers and other types of labor market status transitions have also been declining. So not only do we have less geographic moving, there's less adjustment that's taking place even within local markets. So people are kind of just sticking where they are a little bit more persistently than in the past. This is a little bit surprising to some folks because we often think or we hear that the labor market is so much less stable than it was in the past. I have some work in progress that's actually showing that this is coming in part from the fact that workers who enter a new job are more likely to be retained for 12 months going forward. So it's really happening at that new entrant part of the labor market. We also know from some of Rebecca's work and also by Enrico Moretti that counties and MSAs are diverging on their college attainment and their skill composition. So how do we put these things together to think about what this means for the market for individuals leaving college? Well, what this should paint for you is a picture in which early career location and your early career job match are now potentially more persistent for today's entrants. I'm not going to say whether this is good or bad. We don't yet know that, I don't think, as economists, but what it does mean is that the first place that you land when you exit college and you enter the labor market as a college graduate, which is the focus of this proposal, that's going to be more important to you in a kind of chronological sense, and I think more work remains to be done, but given everything we know about early labor market scarring, it suggests that the impacts of these first career matches are really increasingly important for individuals entering the market today. So what this tells us is that that time of college leaving and entering the labor market is increasingly important in terms of the quality of match individuals get, and we might want to do more for them to try to make sure they're getting the best match. Okay. So a final point that I want to make is that we've seen migration decline overall. You might have thought, well, maybe that was just other kinds of migration, and maybe individuals are still very much responding to these job opportunities that pop up for them. What I've plotted for you here is the share of people who do move, but say that they are moving to take a job or to attend or leave college, okay? And so if you thought that among movers we were really just paring down to individuals who are taking advantage of these labor market opportunities, then what we would see is that over time, more movers are moving for job-related reasons. And in fact that they're flat means that we've had an overall decline in the amount of kind of allocative migration that's happening for workers at this part of the labor market experience. So again, that points to the fact that we, in general, have individuals who do not seem to be making as many of these adjustments on the kind of job-related margin as perhaps we might like to see. And this kind of slowing down, decreased fluidity, decreased levels of adjustment might, and I underscore the word might, be a reason for concern. Okay, so let me summarize the challenge that I think the evidence presents to us. Okay, so there's a big challenge, which is that it does seem that geography is a determinant in individual economic opportunity. The proposal that I'm going to now share with you for the second half of this talk is going to focus very specifically on addressing a small part of that. So if you have not written a policy proposal as an academic, I suspect there's actually two ways to go about it. One is to outline tremendous benefits that might happen if we pursue some kind of general policy, and then hope that policymakers will work out the details for themselves because of the great benefits that appear to be on the table. Another approach is to focus on more modest benefits that we think could be obtained and write a really detailed proposal that you can use kind of off the shelf. And I'm going to give you an example of the second of these. So by no means am I claiming that this is going to address all of the problems or concerns, to use a less weighted term, that we might have about the role of geography and outcomes. I'm instead going to focus on a market where I think the evidence suggests that perhaps it could be working better. We could remove barriers and increase match quality and increase attainment propensity. And that would have likely good effects. Okay? So I'm focusing on a narrow slice of this broader general issue about the relationship between geography and economic opportunity. So let me say, just in kind of economics terms, about why we might want to address these things. So I already told you that proximity to college predicts college attendance. In my view, and I think many economists would share this, this seems very unlikely to be optimal. We know that proximity to college is related to attendance even after we control for a wide variety of parental characteristics. We have the somewhat quasi-experimental evidence from the Lapid paper. There's no great model that would say that colleges get located by all of the people who need them and they don't get located by all of the people who don't need them. So that suggests some inefficiency in that some folks who would benefit from a college education and for whom that would be really productivity enhancing are just not born close to a college. And so we would be better off in terms of efficiency if we could move those folks closer to a college. So I think personally the evidence about this proximity and the role in college attendance being of concern is likely to be shared by a number of economists. I think the place where we want to be even a little bit more careful is the fact that we see college graduates concentrating in large markets, and we also see workers of all types, but also college graduates, sticking in their original or kind of jobs for a longer period of time. It's much less obvious that this is bad. Certainly, it's associated with differences in outcomes, but there are many kinds of productive reasons that individuals would kind of agglomerate in particular markets. There also are kind of high-quality match reasons why individuals would stick with a job the first time that they land one out of an educational experience. I want to kind of underscore that I don't think the profession has a lot of necessarily completely concrete evidence on whether this decline in fluidity is overall good or overall bad. But I think there are reasons to be concerned and reasons to think that reducing barriers to reallocation might not be harmful. And so that's the kind of angle that the second half of the proposal is going to take, is thinking about ways to reduce barriers to this reallocation, particularly at college exit, in ways that we think would not be harmful if, in fact, there were good things operating here as well. Okay, so let's see what the proposal actually is. It comes out of just trying to exhaust the list, which was pretty short, of how we might respond to some of these challenges. So one way to respond to this is to build colleges. That happened for a while. I don't think it's likely to happen anymore, and I wouldn't argue that it's a really efficient way to handle the challenges that we're seeing. Another is to, as I'm going to talk about, increase mobility, or really I should prefer the phrase reduce barriers to mobility and search, particularly among this college-educated population. And then you might think of other kinds of more elaborate or direct place-based support. That's not something I'm going to be covering today, but as we talked about in all the other, many of the other good conversations around the previous panels, there are reasons to think this might be helpful and reasons to think that we might want to proceed with caution there. Okay. So in the college market, I have, as I mentioned, a very specific two-part proposal. How could we address some of the issues that we're seeing here? And in particular, how can we do this in a way that doesn't risk terrible unintended consequences? So on the first part, addressing geographic mobility at college entry. How can we get more folks who have no local college access, but who might benefit from it, to actually go farther away to attend colleges? How could we do that for them without building colleges? Well, my proposal is to use the Pell program, which, if you're not familiar, is a major form of federal need-based aid for college-going students. Those going to 2- and 4-year colleges can qualify. And it's scaled based on your family resources, okay? So that's the first thing to keep in mind, to remember, is that this program is already income targeted. That's what Pell does. So Pell is already identifying students who might have greater financial need than others. So the first part of the proposal says, let's expand the Pell grants that go to applicants from counties that don't have a local college access. Okay, I'm going to say more in detail about both of these parts, but I want to present them as kind of a 1-2 punch, so to speak, around the market as a whole. The second part looks at college exit and asks, are there barriers that we could remove there that might enhance mobility in a way that would be beneficial for individuals who choose to take advantage of that? So I propose that at college exit, we defer federal student loan repayment for individuals who move over a long distance. So you would need to move out of wherever your college was, and we'll talk about that in the questions if we want. You would need to move out of where your college was, but then you would qualify for a deferment on your loan repayments for a full 12 months, okay? So I'm going to talk a bit more about each of those in detail. So how would this actually work? This is the detailed part of the proposal. For the Pell supplement, I propose an annual supplement. So this is something that students would get every year. Pell qualifying students get their Pell every year. So this, again, is just building up the infrastructure that we already have. They would qualify for an annual supplement of up to $5,000. And this would be used ideally to increase total grant aid, not to offset aid that colleges are already providing to students on top of their Pell. One thing to realize is that this is quite a large supplement relative to the maximum Pell amount already. The reason I propose such a large supplement is that I would say we don't know a ton about moving costs, but the little bit that we know really suggests that they are quite large and that they are not well approximated by direct travel costs. You really need to give people quite a big income boost to get them to undertake a long distance move. And so this kind of large Pell top-up reflects that. One way to think about it is that it roughly approximates estimated housing costs for college students for a year. And that, in some kind of grand scale way, is not that different from when we try to get folks to move out of distressed or damaged areas. That's about what we often have to give folks, is kind of their housing costs for a year. So perhaps to a first approximation, this is big enough to make a difference. I also propose using this structure to encourage college going in forms that we actually have experimental evidence are more advantageous for people. There are returns to a 2-year college, and so the first step would give $2,500 in supplement to students attending any kind of 2- or 4-year college. So any Pell qualifying student who did not have local college access would be guaranteed $2,500. But I step that up by $1,500 and then by another $1,000 if students attend a 4-year college instead of a 2-year, and then an additional $1,000 for a state flagship or another qualifying selective institution. So again, we know that attending 4-year colleges can be advantageous. Also attending better colleges, there is evidence in the literature that getting into a better 4-year college versus a less strong 4-year college is also good for folks. So we try to incentivize taking those additional steps. Okay, so I already mentioned the eligibility parts. There's really just this simple two-part step. Already Pell eligibility is determined, in part through the FAFSA application that almost every college student files. So it's already need targeted. And then the second part of targeting is just to ask if students reside in a county with no 2- or 4-year college access at the time of application. Okay. So thinking in a bit more detail about the student loan deferments, again, specifically, this would extend the time that students have until they are required to make their first federal student loan payment to 12 full months after they leave college. The qualification here is that students would have to be either employed or residing in, and again, could talk about what requirements you would want to have on this. I have reasons for having either residency or employment as a qualifying condition, but students have to have made some kind of geographic move to a local market other than where their college is located. Okay. Just to give you a comparison of how this would fit in with what students are currently getting, the current baseline grace period for FSL repayment is 6 months. So if you leave college, whether you graduate or not, 6 months after you leave, you're required to start paying on your federal student loans. But we have automatic exemptions already. You can qualify for an automatic deferment if you enter military service, the Peace Corps, should have put on here, or if you continue full-time schooling, okay? Then there's already an automatic deferment that's indefinite for those conditions. If students would like, they can try to negotiate or obtain other types of repayment structures, like income-dependent repayment or forbearance for economic hardship. But again, those are not guaranteed, and the process for obtaining those, I think, is more challenging, certainly, than for other things that we automatically allow deferrals for. So the current grace period gives students 6 months, and with, I think, some effort, they could try to extend that if they had special conditions, but other than that, they're required to start paying a half a year after they leave college. Okay. So what are the costs, and then what are the benefits that we might get out of this? So an advantage, I think, of both of these proposals is that they really build out two programs that we already have in direct ways, and I think that helps us potentially save on the costs that these might have. So for the Pell supplements, I estimate that the total cost of the benefits that I propose, even though they're large relative to the maximum Pell grant, would only amount to about 1.7% of the current total Pell budget. And that's because there's not going to be perfect take-up. And it's also because the population, and this should say students who are in counties that don't have local college access, the population that would qualify geographically is not that large. So potentially, we could give these students who are quite distant from a college a very big supplement and maybe make a big difference there without necessarily breaking the budget of the Pell program. Now, what are the benefits we would get out of this? Certainly, if this generates new college enrollment, and I think we have a lot of evidence to suggest this is true, this is going to create large benefits. If these are students who would not otherwise attend college and we give them the Pell supplement and that converts them into college goers, this is going to have large income impacts for them for the rest of their lives. However, there's some concern that the supplement would go to individuals who are already planning to attend college. In that case, it might still generate real social benefits in a couple of ways. First, there's some evidence that just giving students Pell access in greater amounts improves their outcomes post-college. So these are students who are already going to college, they're already getting Pell, but in some other research, they qualify for additional Pell money. They seem to work less in college, and then in the end, they have better labor market outcomes down the line that then pays for that added Pell benefit in the form of higher tax rates. So I think we have reasonable evidence that even if this program doesn't move anyone into college, it could move them either to a better college situation, like a more challenging or longer program, or it might ultimately still improve their labor market outcomes down the road by allowing them to kind of focus more on their studies. On the other side of college, this is where I really wish I could be more clear about the benefits. And I admit that I am, I think, speculating, but speculating in a way that's based on a lot of research. So first, the costs. There are no direct costs to this. No one's getting any new money as a result of extending this deferment. We would face some costs in that this has to be administered, and there's some financing costs for delaying this repayment for a longer period of time. I do think there's some reason to think we might actually save on administrative costs, because processing these case-by-case requests for deference and forbearance is probably costly. We already have automatic deferrals for other things. Making that list a little bit longer might actually be a cost-effective way to deal with people who are going to ask for deferrals anyway. So on the bottom line of costs, I have an estimate. I don't think it's likely to be very large. And there's a sense in which we might actually save some money. It's not going to be free, though, just because there's no new money. But I think the cost will be modest. Potentially, the number of affected borrowers is very large. Okay, so this is potentially over 1 million borrowers, and this is with the requirement of a relocation. So we could talk again about whether we would want to expand this to more borrowers than that. But I estimate roughly that you might get over 1 million students to take advantage of this based on the current migration patterns that they exhibit, and some pretty, I would say, generous, in the sense that I'm trying to make this number big to make the program expensive, some generous assumptions about how big the impacts might be on migration. Okay, so we might actually affect a large number of students with this, far larger than the Pell supplements. Would this be beneficial? What are the benefits we would get out of this? Well, to understand that, we need to realize that the program is subsidizing broader labor market search post-college. It's not necessarily requiring that individuals move to any particular kind of market to take advantage of this, but it is allowing them a longer period of time to either search directly or to even experiment with a job in a market that might not be necessarily the one that's closest to them. If they experiment and it fails, they have a year still to find a new employment situation. So some of this is going to be kind of direct search, like I'm actually filing applications and looking at things. And some of it is kind of going to be experience-based search of, I tried something that I thought was a little riskier, but I wanted to try it. And I was maybe encouraged to do that because I knew I had a full year to start repayment on those loans, as opposed to needing to get them in 6 months. So whether this broader search is beneficial, I think for most economists, in general, broader search, more information is going to lead to better matches. Whether this actually changes where students locate, that's something that would need to be evaluated through the program. But what I think is helpful or advantageous about the way I've set this up is that the incentives to try these riskier matches and the incentives to try other markets are pretty weak. So hopefully we would not have students engaging in search that is then, in the end, not ultimately beneficial for them. So I'm going to just wrap up with what I view as the advantages of this proposed approach. So I think it is firmly based in evidence. There's a lot of research that I drew on to think about where these benefits are the most likely to occur, and also what kinds of incentives could we offer that would not be overly distortionary. And that in the end would really just amount to reducing barriers rather than actually incentivizing any particular behavior. I like the fact, personally, that it combines place-based and person-based policy levers. So we're directing resources based on both of those things, particularly on the Pell supplement side. I talked about the fact that this is mainly incentives as opposed to kind of trying to push too hard or encourage things in a too strong a way that might then lead individuals to take up treatments that might not ultimately be helpful for them. Finally, I think this is an example of a way where we can tweak an existing program, build it out in a straightforward way that then has advantages for the population we're trying to affect, and at the same time keeping costs low to that by, again, building on a program that already exists there. We're more likely to have modest costs when we try to do these types of policy changes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all our panelists. So I'd actually like to start the conversation by maybe giving Oren a chance to respond to Abby. Do you feel like what she suggests is at odds with the programs you were hoping to see implemented, or do you think that it's complementary?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first thing to say is just addressing a different problem to a large extent. You know, especially if we talk about the Pell Grant side of it, there's kind of that group of 95,000 seniors The first question is, how many of those 95,000 seniors would be going to college anyway? I think the kind of, and you acknowledge this, the marginal group that we're boosting into college is going to be a subset of that. The next question I'd also want to know is, well, of that subset, what is their college completion rate going to be? I mean, if they're already the most marginal group, presumably their completion rate is going to be a lot lower than the mass that we have already attending college. And so the added number of people we are actually going to move through college to attainment through this policy, as compared to the amount of money we are going to just give to people who are going to graduate from college anyway, and the number of people we are going to push into college only to drop out, I think is kind of, I would expect the cost to exceed the benefits. And then the bigger picture thing I would say is I just don't know why, if we had an extra $500 million to spend, we would spend it on trying to send people away to go to college and not on the people living in that community who are going to be lucky to even find a job with their high school degree.
Yeah, thank you. Abby?
Sure. So I actually would take issue. I think that the benefits will exceed the cost, because I think we have good evidence that giving additional Pell to students, even who are already going to college and who already qualify for Pell, is something that is cost effective in the long run. But we need them to get to the labor market and collect taxes on that. So I think there's reasonable evidence that Pell is cost effective. I also think there's reasonable evidence that getting some college is better than getting no college. So I'm not sure I would use graduation as the metric for whether this is success. Attendance also definitely pays income benefits down the line. I then say that the brain drain concern is something that I thought a lot about in crafting this. This is something where I don't think there's a feasible way to increase educational attainment in these populations that's cost effective. So again, the building colleges plan is just going to be very difficult. So then the question becomes, what do we do? I agree, investing in a sense in those areas is important. This is actually why I have the second part of the proposal in part. I think the targeting in the second part of the proposal is really interesting and important. Economists like it to be less targeted, I will say. I was initially thinking of making it more targeted and requiring students who benefited from those Pell supplements to perhaps move back to localities, or at least to incentivize more search by all college graduates in smaller markets. I ultimately agreed with the economists that I think that's too targeted, but by basically allowing students to have more time to search after college, it gives them a chance to go to these smaller markets and try to either start a business there or find a match there. The fact that the market is smaller just means it's going to take longer for offers to arrive. That doesn't mean that they're not there. But if your federal student loans are kind of looming on your calendar, you may just opt for the option that's closest to you, most convenient and least risky. If you have 12 months, I think that actually might benefit some of these communities. I think it does disproportionately encourage search in these broader, smaller markets as opposed to just going right nearby your college or a big market like New York. But I admit it's not tremendously targeted to those places, and that's because of the concerns that perhaps being too strong in encouraging folks to go there might not ultimately in the long run be beneficial to the students affected.
Yannis.
I mean, there's an added benefit here, I think, which is mixing, improving social cohesion, which underlies actually, personally, I think the numbers that Rad Chetty and associates find. So it's not just college; it's more than that.
Right, Neil.
So two questions, one for Abby and Oren, and then another for Oren. When you talk about mobility going down, I think you're looking interstate. So and I'm just wondering if you capture this. When I travel around our region, which is very rural, most rural communities feel like they're being hollowed out because all their young people are moving to the cities. I can't imagine that they're imagining that. Like, I can't imagine that they're wrong. So I'm just curious how that, if that is in fact happening, how that changes your analysis, or if it does. And then second, Oren, I mean, I think I'm trying to get a sense of your policy recommendation. So you rejected training, you rejected transfers, you rejected moving. So are we just left with trade barriers?
So I'll answer the migration question first. So the work shows that this is any kind of long distance migration is falling over time. So that means between metropolitan areas and other metropolitan areas and across counties as well. But I think where this impression comes from that either it's not falling by much or that migration is detrimental to our community is that individuals are probably making fewer moves over their lifetimes, and that leads to this decline in the overall rate of migration. But the moves that they are making are the ones like you've identified. So it's true in those communities that migration is shrinking their population, but what's happening is those folks move once and then they stay wherever they are. And that's the overall kind of decline in the turnover and the churn that we've identified in the data.
I think the interstate versus within state point is an important distinction. So the data I showed was also just actually, statewide population. And certainly you see within states movement. If you look even within a state like Iowa, though, you see a tremendous amount of diversity in both urban and rural. So there are some rural places that have declined. There are others that are actually doing great. I think the two things I'd say about it, one is the smaller cities that anchor our more rural regions, therefore become even more important in a sense, which is to say that if Des Moines and Duluth and Billings and Columbus and so forth, if those cities are doing well, those can also support very healthy rural communities in, certainly a commuting zone and even beyond, in a way that having virtually all of the prosperity concentrated, like what the EIG result would find in literally kind of 6 MSAs. And so I think that's a distinction. The second thing I'd say is that, and this is more anecdotal also, but might be worth asking people, is do the kids move back? And that I think one thing we've seen that has changed from in the past is that kids always move to the cities, whether for college or just because if you're 19, it makes more sense to be in a city. But that whether families, especially when they're having kids and deciding to settle down themselves, feel like there's anything for them to go back to is a really important determinant of social and economic well-being. On the policy prescription side, so that is what I don't get to in the presentation, what I would say is that the approach I'd really love to see policymakers and economists think about more directly is labor market health. And what I mean by that is that the labor market is just a processing mechanism. It takes the conditions that it encounters in our society and spits out an outcome. And there's an awful lot of policy work we can do on what those conditions are. And so education is one I've started to talk a little about just now, but how much of our emphasis we put on getting everyone up to the threshold of preparing to enter the economy and be a productive worker versus how much emphasis we put on at least getting some people through to the BA, I think is a really important determinant of the kind of labor market outcomes we're going to have. I think the organized labor context that we heard about in another panel is a really important one, that we right now sort of have these two extremes of fairly high conflict Wagner-era unions and nothing. And that probably neither of those is actually ideal for a well-functioning labor market. We probably want other models of organizing that give workers voice and some power, but don't necessarily encourage the hyper-conflict. One more I'll mention, because it refers to something Janet was talking about yesterday, is that the way we think about environmental regulation would change a lot if we were actually focused on labor market outcomes as the most important one. Janet kind of showed all the benefits of fracking and then also said, but there's sort of, there might be environmental disamenities we're not capturing. Two things I'd say is, first of all, we may be overestimating the environmental disamenities. There's no reason to believe that the individual household is biased toward over or underestimating. And the second one is that we just then talked about all sorts of other amenities that come with productive communities that certainly formal cost-benefit analyses ignore. And that actually, especially in more rural areas that need an industrial economy, having higher pollution levels and higher employment levels could very well be welfare enhancing, which is not something that you would see out of a consumer welfare model. And then trade and immigration, I don't think what we're doing right now is the right response, but I think we definitely need to take a more critical and skeptical approach to it than we have historically.
Yes. So can you?
Yeah, so as someone who has a GED and an AA from a community college and a master's degree, I just think, and this is just straight opinion, no data, that the biggest mistake we're making in this country is not offering the first year or two of public college or vocational college for free. I know I worked blue collar and service jobs a lot in my 20s, and there are a lot of people who have the ability to go to college and either be a knowledge worker or go get a vocational education. The reason they don't do it is because they don't want to. And sometimes the answer is just as simple as that, because we're not incentivizing it properly. And so how do we do that? How do we give people the ability to put some of their own skin in the game? And I think sometimes you have to give someone something free to get them into the pipe, right? The Pell Grant idea, I think, is a good one, but there's also times when I think we try and solve complex problems by adding complexity, and that concerns me, because when people already don't understand a system, adding complexity to that system doesn't really necessarily help. So that's just a comment, and feel free to feedback.
Yeah, I'll just say thanks for that. And I actually didn't get to my very last slide, which was, I think the first line was advertisement and communication are essential for making sure they succeed. I absolutely think you're right. Getting into college is a complex process. I think this, again, builds on the fact that Pell exists. People use Pell. This is just bigger Pell. So trying to not make it complicated, but absolutely it would need to be really clearly communicated to students and guidance counselors to tell them in these affected high schools, hey, your students might qualify for this. You should tell them about it. And I'll say I picked the number 5 because I thought that would be a salient number. Yeah.
Okay, real quickly, if you think that college graduates need more time for search, I guess I would recommend you just postpone the loan repayments for everybody.
Yeah.
I really am worried about distorting this decision. I got a job. I went to Penn State, and I got one in Happy Valley, and I have one in Philly, but I better go to Philly so I can delay my. It just seems, and all kinds of potential fraud, and it bothers me. But anyway.
Yep.
I don't know the externality that you're trying to fix.
Right. So again, I had some conversations on the very last slide about ways you might tweak this, and I think personally my favorite way to tweak this would be to just extend deferment for everybody. For the very reasons you said, I'm not sure how super distortionary I think it is if you actually have those 3 offers and you're weighing them in your head and you pick the distant one because you get 12 extra months. I think that's kind of an empirical question as to how big that is, but if we're at all concerned about it and we don't have a compelling reason not to, then we should probably just open this up. I do think there's probably a trade-off between making it politically palatable, and I think this is a middle ground between targeting something that might benefit communities that we're very concerned about with a broader approach that has fewer of the distortions. I do understand that to people who aren't economists, giving them more time for search just sounds like letting them play video games for longer. But I think the data would suggest that this could potentially be very productive for people.
Can I say one other thing about that?
Yes.
Just quickly, I think it feels like part of what's motivating this proposal for good and bad is just cheaper college is better. That is, that people benefit from more Pell Grants, so more Pell Grants are better, and people would benefit if they didn't have to pay their loans back as soon. So loan deferment is better. And my concern with this kind of mindset about higher education is twofold. One is, attaining education and skills is a very economic decision that has very concrete returns in the marketplace. And to the extent that going to college, getting a degree, job searching or not, has economic returns, those are captured by the student. And I worry that when we take those costs away, we are essentially encouraging a lot of less good behavior that is not even going to benefit the individual in the long run. And then the second point is that, therefore, the person we are targeting all these resources to is our nation's college graduates. And if I had to think of a population that I wasn't going to target any resources to, it would be our nation's college graduates.
We have a question here and then a question over here.
Great. So Abby, I was really glad to hear your proposals, which seem eminently reasonable to me, and I'm glad that you're wading into this space. But I think, like Tom, I have a certain hunger for understanding the underlying price theory of what it is that's exactly motivating you. So in terms of the proposal for the extra Pell Grants for people living in no college states, I can think of either an externality based justification or some sort of an equity based justification. The equity one I think is weaker. The externality based justification is that you think that there is some sort of a greater elasticity for these people for getting them into college who live in no college states than people who live in college states. And consequently, since the goal is to try and increase college attendance, presumably because of fiscal externality associated with college going, that you think they're going to provide more taxes and require less in terms of social services, that gives you a very clear number, right? If you think you knew what that elasticity is and you thought you knew the size of the fiscal externality for justifying that. Of course, it does raise the question as to whether or not it's obvious that these are the highest elasticity people relative to other people in other ways of defining our counties or our other group. But I guess I would feel more comfortable if you pushed in that direction in terms of the justification of it, and also which opened the door for actual empirical studies for knowing whether or not this is actually the high elasticity group in terms of who you're bringing in, because it's certainly plausible, but it doesn't seem totally obvious to me.
Right.
The second question is it obvious that this is an equity case? That seems less clear to me. You can tell a story, obviously, that any parents who bothered to live in these wonderful rural communities that Neil is describing are sacrificing their children for their own pleasure. That is possible, in which case they're particularly harmful. But I doubt that would be something that necessarily would resonate all that well in terms of lots of people living in places with Wayne State are also suffering. So the equity case seems to be less strong than the greater elasticity case. On the case of the delaying, I guess one thing that I wonder a lot about is, do we have evidence that suggests that the extra delay actually does create a cost in having higher default rates? I guess that was something I tried to Google quickly and wasn't sure about that. And then I guess the question is to what extent, again, if we're trying to fix the fiscal externality here, if we think that's the thing, we should probably have an experimental program that actually tries a bunch of different variants, including a moving based one, including just a general deferment, including whatever else Tom and you can dream up for in terms of deferral policies that actually and see which ones have the largest impact on long run earnings and gradually build up the evidence base from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate all of those comments. I think I'll just respond to one just for the sake of time and other questions. I just learned over a dinner conversation last night that and the country where this happened is escaping me. But one country tried this very program of allowing longer repayment rates and found better matches and higher earnings for students who had a longer time to search coming out of college.
Tied to mobility or just any?
No, just any. Yeah, just any. Yeah, and 100% agree. If we're going to try a program, let's evaluate it. I think both of these lend themselves to it. So unfortunately, it doesn't go without saying when programs get tweaked, but I wish that it went without saying. Yeah.
Thank you.
So just curious about this linkage between skills, aptitude, and the pipeline from K-12 into post-secondary. This is a issue that we're really stuck on, I think, in local government, is that we seem to not be preparing children to think about their post-K-12 career. And so wondering if there's a linkage here between some of the research you're doing about college and some of Owen's research, or Oren, research around skills and aptitude, and then the speaker this morning, Morgan Frank, around skills and aptitude, thinking about some models in Europe where children are assessed at, say, the 8th grade level to determine where they're headed in terms of their post K-12 career. And wondering if any of you've done that type of research to determine if we could be doing a better job of preparing kids around their aptitudes for their post K-12 work. I know I probably, and everyone in this room, was not well prepared for that. You were either on a college track or you weren't. And I would suggest that perhaps there is a different path, and that would be borne out by Oren's work here. But I'm just curious to hear about that.
I can say a little bit about that. I mean, I think what you just said about the tracks is exactly right, that Europe has a very different model, and the Europeans kind of think we're crazy on this question, that we try to send everyone to college. I mean, by OECD country, kind of 40 to 70% put students in a non-college track, and then you read the OECD report and the US gets a footnote that we can't be on the chart because our system is too different. The US, of course, is going back to the 60s and 70s, and partly for very serious racial inequality reasons, completely rejected tracking. The problem with that is, as you just said, we do still track, but we only have one track, and it's called the college track. And it's always a helpfully thought experiment with tracking opponents to tell them, I agree we should only have one track. It's going to be targeted at the median student. It's going to be who still doesn't even complete a community college degree. It's going to focus on vocational education. And if you want to enroll your kid in a college prep evening course, 3 towns over, be my guest. And then all of a sudden, they're much more interested in tracking. So I ultimately think of it as a type 1, type 2 error problem, that we have leaned all the way to say we would rather, let there not be a single child who could go to college and doesn't, no matter how many kids who probably shouldn't go to college we help along. And then the question is just, is that optimal or not? I think you actually do a lot of interesting economic analysis on whether it's optimal or not, and that would change from a GDP versus worker welfare lens. But then my experience with this is it's actually more of a cultural problem at this point, that especially for politicians, but more broadly, everyone's happy for a vocational track for someone else's kids. And having that discussion and changing that mindset, the work I'm doing right now is focused on actually bringing data to people and letting them know that actually the bottom half of the earnings distribution for college grads is below the top half of the earnings distribution for high school grads. So we compare median high school grad to median college grad and say, well, obviously everyone should go to college, but that's not the same person. And that the outcomes, and that's before we even do anything really good for the people that could be on a high school track. And so helping people understand that we're just not thinking about it right, and that actually there are great outcomes for people who pursue that track. And no one hears about it, but there are an awful lot of not great outcomes, even for people who attain a college degree on the college track. I think that's where the discussion has to go.
So can I actually wanted to ask a question of Oren to pick up on the fact that you just mentioned about the distributions of high school grad earnings versus college grad earnings. And it's related to your chart, which you identified as your favorite chart, which was the map, showing a big delta in basically government income receipt of some kind. And it looked from the note like that includes Social Security, because retirement was in the note, and it also includes DI, but it includes other things. Both of these facts are strongly related to age and aging of the population as well. And so I was wondering, and my understanding is that this overlap is less dramatic if we adjust for the fact that high school graduates in the population are on average older than college graduates because more people have been, or college attenders because more people have been attending. And I'm wondering if something similar might be happening in that chart. If we adjust for the fact that the population is aging, lots more people are getting government income in the form of Social Security. Have you done that kind of analysis to see how much that drives the change in those deltas over time?
Well, so 2 issues. On the question of the map, you're right, it includes Social Security, and I haven't done one that strips that out, partly because the point that I'm emphasizing is not necessarily that somehow kind of the welfare state has exploded, but rather that local economies are increasingly dependent on, in other words, it would be nice to see personal income, market income going up in those areas, at least proportionately. So, you could strip it out. We also know that welfare state spending has exploded over the last 40 years. So that would, the colors would certainly still change, and distributionally they would still change mostly in the less prosperous urban areas. The education question I have done some work on, and I think it's a crucial point, is that, well, okay, but if we're just seeing the high school grads in their 50s compared to the college grads in their 20s, that doesn't tell you anything. There's a very good report from Georgetown that looks at life cycle earnings that still shows a very significant overlap. And I've done a preliminary, and we're working on this right now at Manhattan Institute, going by MSA, by age group. And what we find is that it separates it a little bit, but not very much. And that even if you look just at 25 to 29-year-olds in a single MSA, the top kind of 30 to 35% of high school earners are earning more than the bottom 30 to 35% of college grads.
So this discussion has been extremely interesting, and if any of you have questions over lunch for Oren, Yannis, or Abigal, or Abby, feel free to ask them. Thank you all.